Manchukuo was a puppet state in northeast China and Inner Mongolia, which was governed under a form of constitutional monarchy. The area, collectively known as Manchuria by Westerners and Japanese, was designated by China's erstwhile Qing Dynasty as the homeland of the ruling family's ethnic group, the Manchus. But the Manchus themselves never used Manchuria as a place name to refer to the area. In 1931, the region was seized by Japan following the Mukden Incident, and a pro-Japanese government was installed 1 year later with Puyi, the last king-emperor, as the nominal regent and emperor. Manchukuo's government was abolished in 1945 after the defeat of Imperial Japan at the end of World War II. The territories formerly claimed by the puppet state were first seized in the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in August 1945, and then formally transferred to Chinese administration in the following year. Manchus formed a minority in Manchukuo, whose largest ethnic group were Han Chinese. The population of Koreans increased during the Manchukuo period, and there were also Japanese, Mongols, White Russians and other minorities. The Mongol regions of western Manchukuo were ruled under a slightly different system in acknowledgement of the Mongolian traditions there. The southern part of the Liaodong Peninsula was ruled by Japan as the Kwantung-Lee's territory. History. Terminology. Manchuria is a transcription of the Japanese reading of the Chinese word, which means Manchuria, which in Japanese is Manchu, which in turn dates from the 19th century. The name Manchuo was invented and given to the Jurchen people by Hong Taiji in 1635 as a new name for their ethnic group. However, the name Manchuria was never used by the Manchus of the Qing Dynasty itself to refer to the homeland. According to the Japanese scholar Junko Miyawaki Okada, the Japanese geographer Takahashi Keijiyasu was the first to use the term as a place name in 1809 in the Nippon Henkai Ryakuzu, and it was from that work where Westerners adopted the name. According to Mark C. Elliott, Katsuragawa Hoshu's 1794 work, the Hokus Bunryakus was where first appeared as a place name, in 2 maps included in the work, Ashiyazanzu and Chikyu Hankyusizu, which were also created by Katsuragawa, then began to appear as a place names in more maps created by Japanese like Kondijuzo, Takahashi Keijiyasu, Baba Sadayoshi and Yamada Ren. These maps were brought to Europe by the Dutch Philip von Siebold. According to Nakami Tatsuo, Philip Franz von Siebold was the one who brought the usage of the term Manchuria to Europeans, after borrowing it from the Japanese, who were the first to use it in a geographic manner in the 18th century. While neither the Manchu nor Chinese languages had a term in their own language equivalent to Manchuria as a geographic place name, according to Bill Sewell, it was Europeans who first started using Manchuria as a name to refer to the location, and it is not a genuine geographic term. The historian Gavin McCormack agreed with Robert H. G. Lee's statement that the term Manchuria or Manchu is a modern creation used mainly by Westerners and Japanese, with McCormack writing that the term Manchuria is imperialistic in nature and has no precise meaning, since the Japanese deliberately promoted the use of Manchuria as a geographic name to promote its separation from China while they were setting up the puppet state of Manchukuo. Background: the Japanese had their own motive for deliberately spreading the usage of the term Manchuria. The historian Norman Smith wrote that the term Manchuria is controversial. Professor Mariko Asano Tamanoi said that she should use the term in quotation marks when referring to Manchuria. Herbert Giles wrote that Manchuria was unknown to the Manchus themselves as a geographical expression. Professor Chad D. Garcia noted that usage of the term Manchuria is out of favor in currently scholarly practice, and he did away with using the term, using instead the Northeast, or referring to specific geographical features. The Qing Dynasty, which replaced the Shan and Ming dynasties in China, was founded by Manchus from Manchuria. The Manchu emperors separated the homeland in Jilin and Heilongjiang from the Han Liaoning province with the Willow Palisade. This ethnic division continued until the Qing Dynasty encouraged massive immigration of Han in the 19th century during Changguandong to prevent the Russians from seizing the area from the Qing. After conquering the Ming, the Qing identified the state as China and referred to it as Dulimbai Gurun in Manchu. The Qing equated the lands of the Qing state as China in both the Chinese and Manchu languages, defining China as a multi-ethnic state, rejecting the idea that China only meant Han areas, proclaiming that both Han and non-Han peoples were part of China, using China to refer to the Qing in official documents, international treaties, and foreign affairs, and the Chinese language referred to Chinese, Manchu, and Mongol languages, and the term Chinese people referred to all Han, Manchus, and Mongol subjects of the Qing. The lands in Manchuria were explicitly stated by the Qing to belong to China in Qing edicts and in the Treaty of Nerchinsk. During the Qing dynasty, the area of Manchuria was known as the Three Eastern Provinces since 1683, when Jilin and Heilongjiang were separated, even though it was not until 1907 that they were turned into actual provinces. The area of Manchuria was then converted into 3 provinces by the late Qing government in 1907. Since then, the 3 northeast provinces was officially used by the Qing government in China to refer to this region, and the post of viceroy of 3 northeast provinces was established to take charge of these provinces. During its reign, the Qing dynasty became highly integrated with Chinese culture. The dynasty reached its height in the 18th century, during which both territory and population were increased. However, its military power weakened thereafter, and, faced with massive rebellions and defeat in wars, the Qing dynasty declined after the mid-19th century. As the power of the court in Beijing weakened, many outlying areas either broke free or fell under the control of imperialist powers. In the 19th century, Imperial Russia was most interested in the northern lands of the Qing Empire. In 1858, Russia gained control over a huge tract of land called Outer Manchuria thanks to the supplementary Treaty of Beijing that ended the Second Opium War. But Russia was not satisfied, and, as the Qing dynasty continued to weaken, they made further efforts to take control of the rest of Manchuria. Inner Manchuria came under strong Russian influence in the 1890s with the building of the Chinese Eastern Railway through Harbin to Vladivostok. Origins as a direct result of the Russo-Japanese War. Japanese influence replaced Russia's in Inner Manchuria. In 1906, Japan laid the South Manchurian Railway to Port Arthur. Between World War I and World War II, Manchuria became a political and military battleground between Russia, Japan, and China. Japan moved into Outer Manchuria as a result of the chaos following the Russian Revolution of 1917. A combination of Soviet military successes and American economic pressure forced the Japanese to withdraw from the area. However, and Outer Manchuria returned to Soviet control by 1925. During the warlord period in China, the warlord Zhang Zuolin established himself in Inner Manchuria with Japanese backing. Later, the Japanese Kwantung Army found him too independent, so he was assassinated in 1928. After the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, Japanese militarists moved forward to separate the region from Chinese control and to create a Japanese-aligned puppet state. To create an air of legitimacy, the last emperor of China, Puyi, was invited to come with his followers and act as the head of state for Manchuria. One of his faithful companions was Zhang Xiaoxu, a king reformist and loyalist. On the 18th of February 1932, the Manchu state was proclaimed and recognized by Japan on the 15th of September 1932 through the Japan-Manchukuo Protocol. After the assassination of Japanese Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi, the city of Changchun, renamed Sinking, became the capital of the new entity. Chinese in Manchuria organized volunteer armies to oppose the Japanese, and the new state required a war lasting several years to pacify the country. The Japanese initially installed Puyi as head of state in 1932, and 2 years later he was declared emperor of Manchukuo with the era name of Qing. Manchukuo thus became the Great Manchurian Empire, sometimes termed Manchukuo. Zhang Xiaoxu served as Manchukuo's first prime minister until 1935, when Zhang Jinghui succeeded him. Puyi was nothing more than a figurehead, and real authority rested in the hands of the Japanese military officials. An imperial palace was specially built for the emperor. The Manchu ministers all served as front men for the Japanese vice ministers, who made all decisions. In this manner, Japan formally detached Manchukuo from China in the course of the 1930s. With Japanese investment and rich natural resources, the area became an industrial powerhouse. Manchukuo had its own issued banknotes and postal stamps. Several independent banks were founded as well. In 1935, Manchukuo bought the Chinese Eastern Railway from the Soviet Union. Diplomatic recognition: China did not recognize Manchukuo, but the two sides established official ties for trade, communications and transportation. In 1933, the League of Nations adopted the Lytton Report as declaring that Manchuria remained rightfully part of China, leading Japan to resign its membership. The Manchukuo case persuaded the United States to articulate the so-called Stimson Doctrine, under which international recognition was withheld from changes in the international system created by force of arms. In spite of the League of Nations approach, the new state was diplomatically recognized by El Salvador and the Dominican Republic, the Soviet Union, Italy, Spain, Germany and Hungary. It is commonly believed that the Holy See established diplomatic relations with Manchukuo in 1934, but the Holy See never did so. This belief is partly due to the erroneous reference in Bernardo Bertolucci's 1987 film The Last Emperor that the Holy See diplomatically recognized Manchukuo. Bishop August Ernest Pierre Gaspes was appointed as representative ad tempus of the Holy See and of the Catholic missions of Manchukuo to the government of Manchukuo by the Congregation de Propaganda Fide and not by the Secretariat of State responsible for diplomatic relations with states. After the outbreak of World War II, the state was recognized by Slovakia, Vichy France, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, Denmark, Croatia, all controlled or influenced by Japan's ally Germany, as well as by China's Wang Jingwei government, Thailand and the Philippines, all under Japanese control. World War II and aftermath. Before World War II, the Japanese colonized Manchukuo and used it as a base from which to invade China. In the summer of 1939, a border dispute between Manchukuo and the Mongolian People's Republic resulted in the Battle of Kharkhin Gol. During this battle, a combined Soviet-Mongolian force defeated the Japanese Kwantung army supported by limited Manchukuoan forces. On 8 August 1939, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, in accordance with the agreement at the Yalta Conference, and invaded Manchukuo from Outer Manchuria and Outer Mongolia. This was called Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation. During the Soviet offensive, the army of Manchukuo, on paper a 200,000-man force, performed poorly and whole units surrendered to the Soviets without firing a single shot. There were even cases of armed riots and mutinies against the Japanese forces. Emperor Qing had hoped to escape to Japan to surrender to the Americans, but the Soviets captured him and eventually extradited him to the Communist government in China, where the authorities had him imprisoned as a war criminal along with all other captured Manchukuo officials. From 1945 to 1948, Manchuria served as a base area for the People's Liberation Army in the Chinese Civil War against the National Revolutionary Army. The Chinese Communists used Manchuria as a staging ground until the final nationalist retreat to Taiwan in 1949. Many Manchukuo army and Japanese Kantokan personnel served with the communist troops during the Chinese Civil War against the nationalist forces. Most of the 1.5 million Japanese who had been left in Manchukuo at the end of World War II were sent back to the homeland in 1946 to 1948 by U.S. Navy ships in the operation now known as the Japanese Repatriation from Huladao. Politics. Historians generally consider Manchukuo a puppet state of Imperial Japan because of the Japanese military's strong presence and strict control of the government administration. Chinese historians generally refer to the state as Wei Manchukuo. Some historians see Manchukuo as an effort at building a glorified Japanese state in mainland Asia that deteriorated due to the pressures of war. The independence of Manchuria was proclaimed on the 18th of February 1932, and renamed to Manchukuo. The Japanese military commander appointed Puyi as regent for the time being, stating that he would become emperor of Manchukuo but could not reign using the title of emperor of the Great Qing Empire as he once held. Manchukuo was proclaimed a monarchy on the 1st of March 1934, with Puyi assuming the throne under the reign name of Emperor Qing. Puyi was assisted in his executive duties by a Privy Council and a General Affairs State Council. This State Council was the center of political power and consisted of several cabinet ministers, each assisted by a Japanese vice minister. The commanding officer of the Kwantung Army in Manchukuo was additionally the Japanese ambassador to Manchukuo. He functioned in a manner similar to that of a British resident officer in British overseas protectorates, with the power to veto decisions by the emperor. The Kwantung Army leadership placed Japanese vice ministers in his cabinet, while all Chinese advisors gradually resigned or were dismissed. The Legislative Council was largely a ceremonial body, existing to rubber-stamp decisions issued by the State Council. The only authorized political party was the government-sponsored Concordia Association, although various émigré groups were permitted their own political associations. When the Japanese surrender was announced on the 15th of August 1945, Puyi was asked to abdicate, which he did. Head of State, Prime Minister, Administrative Divisions. See List of Administrative Divisions of Manchukuo for a complete list of prefecture-level divisions. During its short-lived existence, Manchukuo was divided into between 5 and 19 provinces, 1 special ward of Pimen and 2 special cities which were Sinking and Harbin. Each province was divided into between 4 and 24 prefectures. Pimen lasted less than 3 years and Harbin was later incorporated into Binqiang province. Lunqiang also existed as a province in the 1932 before being divided into Haihe, Lunqiang and Sangqiang in 1934. Antung and Qinchao provinces separated themselves from Fengshan, while Binqiang and Qiantao from Kirin separated themselves in the same year. Demographics. In 1908, the number of residents was 15,834,000, which rose to 30 million in 1931 and 43 million for the Manchukuo state. The population balance remained 123 men to 100 women, and the total number in 1941 was 50 million. Other statistics indicate that in Manchukuo the population rose by 18 million. In early 1934, the total population of Manchukuo was estimated as 30,880,000, with 6.1 persons the average family, and 122 men for each 100 women. These numbers included 29,510,000 Chinese, 590,760 Japanese, 680,000 Koreans, and 98,431 of other nationality, White Russians, Mongols, etc. Around 80% of the population was rural. During the existence of Manchukuo, the ethnic balance did not change significantly, except that Japan increased the Korean population in China. The majority of Han Chinese in Manchukuo believed that Manchuria was rightfully part of China, who both passively and violently resisted Japan's propaganda that Manchukuo was a multinational state. From Japanese sources come these numbers. In 1940, the total population in Manchukuo of Lungqiang, Jehol, Kirin, Liaoning and Xinjiang provinces at 43,233,954, or an Interior Ministry figure of 31,008,600. Another figure of the period estimated the total population as 36,933,000 residents. Around the same time, the Soviet Union was advocating the Siberian Jewish Autonomous Oblast across the Manchukuo Soviet border. Some Japanese officials investigated a plan to attract Jewish refugees to Manchukuo as part of the colonization efforts, which was never adopted. As official policy, the Japanese Wedek Yusuke labeled all 30 million people in Manchuria as Manchus, including Han Chinese, despite the fact that most of them were not ethnic Manchu, and the Japanese written Great Manchukuo built upon Ueda's argument to claim that all 30 million Manchus in Manchukuo had the right to independence to justify splitting Manchukuo from China. In 1942, the Japanese written 10-year history of the construction of Manchukuo attempted to emphasize the right of ethnic Japanese to the land of Manchukuo while attempting to delegitimize the Manchus' claim to Manchukuo as the native land, noting that most Manchus moved out during the Qing period and only returned later. Population of main cities: New Chuang, Mukden, Sinking, Harbin, Daren, Antung, Kirin, Sitsiha. Japanese population. In 1931–2, there were 100,000 Japanese farmers. Other sources mention 590,760 Japanese inhabitants. Other figures for Manchukuo speak of a Japanese population 240,000 strong, later growing to 837,000. In Sinking, they made up 25% of the population. The Japanese government had official plans projecting the emigration of 5 million Japanese to Manchukuo between 1936 and 1956. Between 1938 and 1942, a batch of young farmers of 200,000 arrived in Manchukuo. Joining this group after 1936 were 20,000 complete families. When Japan lost sea and air control of the Yellow Sea, this migration stopped. fact, when the Red Army invaded Manchukuo, they captured 850,000 Japanese settlers, with the exception of some civil servants and soldiers. These were repatriated to Japan in 1946–7. Many Japanese orphans in China were left behind in the confusion by the Japanese government and were adopted by Chinese families. Many, however, integrated well into Chinese society. In the 1980s, Japan began to organize a repatriation program for them, but not all chose to go back to Japan. The majority of Japanese left behind in China were women, and these Japanese women mostly married Chinese men and became known as stranded war wives, because they had children fathered by Chinese men. The Japanese women were not allowed to bring the Chinese families back with them to Japan, so most of them stayed. Japanese law only allowed children fathered by Japanese fathers to become Japanese citizens. Economy. Manchukuo experienced rapid economic growth and progress in its social systems. During the 1920s, the Japanese army, under the influence of the Wehrstaat theories popular with the Reichswehr, had started to advocate their own version of the Wehrstaat, the totalitarian national defense state, which would mobilize an entire society for war in peacetime. An additional influence on the Japanese total war school, who tended to be very anti-capitalist, was the first five-year plan in the Soviet Union, which provided an example of rapid industrial growth achieved without capitalism. At least part of the reason why the Kuomintang army seized Manchuria in 1931 was to use it as a laboratory for creating an economic system geared towards the national defense state. Colonial Manchuria offered up possibilities for the army carrying out drastic economic changes that were not possible in Japan. For the beginning, the army intended to turn Manchukuo into the industrial heartland of the empire, and starting in 1932, the army sponsored a policy of forced industrialization that was closely modeled after the five-year plan in the Soviet Union, reflecting the dislike of capitalism. The zaibatsu were excluded from Manchukuo, and all of the heavy industrial factories were built and owned by army-owned corporations. In 1935, there was a change when the reform bureaucrat Nobusuke Kishi was appointed Deputy Minister of Industrial Development. Kishi persuaded the army to allow the zaibatsu to invest in Manchukuo, arguing that having the state carry out the entire industrialization of Manchukuo was costing too much money. Kishi pioneered an etatist system where bureaucrats such as himself developed economic plans, which the zaibatsu had to then carry out. Kishi succeeded in marshalling private capital in a very strongly state-directed economy to achieve his goal of vastly increased industrial production, while at the same time displaying utter indifference to the exploited Chinese workers toiling in Manchukuo's factories. The American historian Mark Driscoll described Kishi's system as a necropolitical system where the Chinese workers were literally treated as dehumanized cogs within a vast industrial machine. The system that Kishi pioneered in Manchuria of a state-guided economy where corporations made their investments on government orders later served as the model for Japan's post-1945 development, albeit not with the same level of brutal exploitation as in Manchukuo. By the 1930s, Manchukuo's industrial system was among the most advanced, making it one of the industrial powerhouses in the region. Manchukuo's steel production exceeded Japan's in the late 1930s. Many Manchurian cities were modernized during Manchukuo era. However, much of the country's economy was often subordinated to Japanese interests, and, during the war, raw material flowed into Japan to support the war effort. Traditional lands were taken and redistributed to Japanese farmers, with local farmers relocated and forced into collective farming units over smaller areas of land. See also Central Bank of Manchukuo, Manchukuo Yuan, Manchukuo Hikoki Shiso KK, Manchukuo Koku KK, Showa Steelworks, Manchurian Industrial Development Company, Manchukuo Film Association. Transport. The Japanese built an efficient and impressive railway system that still functions well today. Known as the South Manchuria Railway Company Mantetsu, this large corporation came to own large stakes in many industrial projects throughout the region. Mantetsu personnel were active in the pacification of occupied China during World War II.